I always thought the stories about the mountains around my town were just local legends, strange tales about creatures that disguise themselves as those we love. I never believed it until the night I went to pick up my girlfriend from a party. She was there with the same smile as always, but something was terribly wrong. When I finally realized, it was too late. What got into my car wasn't my girlfriend, but something terrifying that changed my life forever. I always heard the stories my grandparents told about the mountains surrounding our town. Since I was a child, they whispered about things that roamed around at night, things that hid in plain sight, mimicking loved ones. They believed these creatures were dangerous, but no one could ever explain what they really did. They just said one thing: if it looks like someone you know, take a good look. Sometimes, it's not who you think. I always considered that pure folklore. Nonsense the old folks told to scare children. The town was small, peaceful, and though we had a deep connection with nature and the mountains, everything seemed calm. Too normal for anything strange to happen. It was a Friday night, and my girlfriend, Megan, was at a party across town. I hadn't gone because I was exhausted from a long week of work, but I promised I'd pick her up late that night. At 11:30, my phone buzzed on the couch. A message from her: "Hey, can you come get me? I'm waiting outside." I glanced out the window. It was windy, and the air outside felt heavier than usual. That kind of sensation you get before a storm, where the silence in town becomes more noticeable, almost suffocating. But I didn't think much of it. I grabbed my car keys and went to pick her up. The road leading to the other side of town cut through the mountains, a deserted and poorly lit path. Just a few old streetlights broke through the darkness, flickering from time to time, but the shadows always seemed to swallow the light, as if the darkness was thicker than it should be. The party was at a small house near the forest, isolated from the others. The townspeople always used that place for gatherings because it was far enough that no one complained about the noise. As I approached, I saw Megan standing at the side of the road. She was wearing the same dress she had chosen earlier, her hair tied in a bun, like she always did when going out at night. She had her arms crossed and was looking at me with that calming smile, as if saying everything was fine. She looked normal, but when she got into the car, something inside me screamed. An instinct, maybe, something I couldn't understand at the time, but it made me grip the steering wheel harder than necessary. She closed the door, adjusted her seatbelt, and looked ahead, still smiling, but in a strange way. It wasn't the usual light and warm smile. It seemed forced, rigid, as if her mouth was stuck in an uncomfortable position. We didn't say anything for a while, and the silence was suffocating. Every beat of my heart seemed to echo in the car. My hands started to sweat, and something inside me told me I should get out of there. But how? Megan was right next to me, or at least that's what I thought. As I drove back home, I started to notice small details. Her skin, it looked different, paler, almost too stretched, like it was under a thin layer of plastic. And her eyes, those eyes that always made me lose track of time, were now glazed over, lifeless, as if she was just present physically. Nothing more. I tried to make conversation, more to break the ice than out of curiosity. "Did you enjoy the party?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't respond. She just kept looking ahead, the smile still fixed on her face. I could hear her breathing, but it was almost mechanical, too rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. The discomfort turned into terror. I wanted to stop the car, open the door, and run. But how could I explain this to myself? It didn't make sense. "It's Megan," I repeated mentally. "She's just tired, that's all." When we arrived at my house, the relief I was expecting didn't come. On the contrary, it felt like something even worse was about to happen. I parked the car in front of the garage, and before I could say anything, My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a message from Megan. My stomach dropped. "Where are you?" "I'm waiting for you at the party." I swallowed hard, feeling panic crawl up my spine like an electric current. I glanced over at the passenger seat. She was still there, or whatever was pretending to be my girlfriend was. I froze for a moment. What the hell was in my car? She slowly turned her head toward me, and for the first time, she spoke. "Thanks for the ride." The voice, it wasn't hers. It was like the sound of something trying to be human, but failing miserably. Suddenly, everything my grandparents told me about the mountains and the creatures called skinwalkers that mimic our loved ones made horrible sense. And now I was here, alone, with one of those things sitting beside me. I couldn't move. My entire body was paralyzed with fear, as if an invisible hand was holding me in place. That she, or whatever it was sitting next to me, was looking at me with that same lifeless smile. Her eyes, void of life, stared at me as if they knew something I didn't. "Thanks for the ride," she repeated, this time in a lower, almost whispered tone. There was no emotion. It sounded hollow, disconnected. The words echoed inside the car, blending with the sound of my ragged breathing. I couldn't tear my gaze away from her eyes. They were fixed on me, empty, but at the same time, intense. It was as if she was waiting for something. For me, maybe, or for a mistake I might make. My phone was still vibrating in my lap. The notifications of Megan's message kept flashing. She was still there at the party, waiting for me to pick her up. That, at least, told me that the thing next to me wasn't my girlfriend. I took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to do something. Whatever was with me now wasn't human, and I needed to get out of there. But with every move I tried to make, it felt like my mind was betraying me. My muscles locked up. My dry throat refused to let any words out. Only adrenaline was pumping through my veins, making me even more anxious. That silence between us was disturbing, and it seemed like it didn't care. It just sat there, motionless, except for the smile that wouldn't fade. It made me feel like prey, about to be devoured. I decided to act, even if it was a desperate impulse. I forced my hands to move and pulled the keys from the ignition. The car went dark, plunging the street into deep darkness. It wasn't a good idea, but I didn't know what else to do. There was something about being in total silence that gave me a false sense of control. I turned to her with a hesitant voice, trying to sound firm, but my throat betrayed my fear. "Who are you?" The response didn't come immediately. She just kept watching me, as if processing the question. Then, her lips moved, but the smile didn't fade. "I'm Megan," she said with the same cold voice. My heart raced even faster. You're not Megan?" I stammered, retreating as much as I could in the driver's seat, trying to put some distance between us despite the confined space of the car. Megan is still at the party. That's when something changed. Her eyes, which had been glazed until now, sparked with something. Maybe anger, or maybe just a sort of predatory patience running out. The smile she had maintained stretched grotesquely, pulling her lips in an impossible way. It was as if her skin was about to tear. That thing in the passenger seat wasn't human. I knew that now more than ever. I abruptly opened the car door and jumped out, falling to my knees on the sidewalk, gasping for air. My thoughts were jumbled, and fear pulsed in my head, clouding any logical thinking. I needed to get out of there, but every part of my body felt like it weighed a ton. For a brief second, silence filled the air. I glanced back at the car, expecting to see that macabre smile again, but the passenger seat was empty. My head spun. Had she disappeared? How was that possible? I didn't even hear the door open or close. Panic raced through my veins. Was she outside, in the shadows, waiting to grab me? I looked around, trying to see something in the darkness. Nothing. Just the wind moving the trees and the distant sound of crickets. My phone was still in my hand. Trembling, I unlocked the screen and opened Megan's message. The real Megan. She was still at the party, unaware of what was happening to me. I thought about replying, telling her what had just happened, but I stopped. How could I explain this? I'm here. I got a ride with something that looked like you, but it wasn't. No one would believe that. With trembling fingers, I finally typed, I'm on my way. Don't leave where you are. I put the phone in my pocket and looked at the car again. Part of me expected her to still be inside, waiting with that distorted smile. But no, the car was deserted, too quiet. I started the car once more, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that I could drive to the party and get out of there as quickly as possible. I turned on the engine and began to drive, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. My eyes kept wandering to the mirrors, expecting to see that thing lurking between the trees or maybe back in the passenger seat. With each mile I drove, the air felt heavier, almost as if something invisible was clinging to the back of the car. The road, winding and empty, seemed to stretch the further I went, the streetlights flickering at erratic intervals. It was as if the road itself was conspiring against me. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The radio was off, but I could swear I heard a faint whisper in the background, something that blended with the sound of the wind outside. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the house where the party was held appeared in the distance, with a few lights still on and muffled voices in the background. My muscles relaxed, but only for a moment. I couldn't just tell what had happened. And even worse, what would I do when I saw Megan? What was waiting for me in that house? Was it really her? When I finally stopped the car in front of the house, I felt my heart in my throat. The porch lights vaguely illuminated the yard, and a few people were still outside, talking and laughing as if the world around them was completely normal. But to me, nothing seemed right anymore. Not after what happened. I turned off the car but didn't move immediately. I stayed there, staring at the entrance of the house, wondering if I should really go in. The idea of seeing Megan again, or what looked like her, made my stomach turn with unbearable dread. I pulled out my phone and opened her message again. The same one as before. Where are you? I'm waiting for you at the party. My throat was dry. Megan was still there, waiting for me. But the real question was, who would I see when I walked in? I took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts spinning in my head. I forced myself out of the car. Every step I took toward the house felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself was trying to hold me back, as if it knew something was wrong. I opened the gate and entered, my hands cold and sweaty. As I approached the door, I saw Megan from afar, standing on the porch. She was chatting with some friends, laughing carefree. The soft light from the porch lit up her face, and for a brief moment, I had the impression that everything was normal. She looked just like always, the same hair, the same way of laughing, that smile that always won me over. But after what happened in the car, my instincts screamed that something was wrong. Everything seemed too staged, an exaggerated version of Megan, almost as if it were an imitation. She saw me coming and waved, still smiling. You took a while. Her voice was familiar, but something about it didn't sound right. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, and it was enough to make my heart race. I stopped at the base of the porch, watching her with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Every fiber of my being was telling me to run, not to believe what I was seeing. But another part of me, the rational part, insisted that I was just being paranoid, that I was seeing things where there was nothing. I got a little delayed, I responded, my voice hesitant, slowly climbing the porch steps. My eyes never left her, trying to catch some detail, something that would give away if it was really her. Megan approached and gave me a kiss on the cheek, a normal gesture, as usual. But when I felt the touch of her skin against mine, a chill ran through my body. It wasn't exactly cold, but dry, almost rough, and the sensation hit me like an uncomfortable reminder of what I had felt in the car. Are you okay? She asked, with a look of concern that I couldn't completely decipher. It was as if she was trying hard to seem genuine, but there was a small flaw. Something in her eyes, in her expression. I don't know. I didn't know what to say. How How do you respond to someone who may or may not be the person you know? I looked around, realizing that her friends had moved away and were continuing their conversation as if nothing was happening. Everything around seemed routine, too normal, but my mind was already shattered by doubt.
Yeah, I'm
fine, I managed to respond, my voice coming out lower than I intended. She smiled again, but this time, I saw something in her eyes that chilled me to the bone. It was the same glazed look I had seen in the thing that got into the car. Subtle, hidden, but it was there. My head started to spin. No, it couldn't be. I was trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just tired, stressed, and seeing things. But the fear crawling up my spine was very real. "Shall we go?" she suggested, extending her hand to me. The touch of her hand was the final straw. As soon as her skin touched mine, I felt a jolt of terror shoot through my body. It was the same sensation I felt in the car. This wasn't her. I didn't know how, but it was clear. That thing was trying to trick me again. I pulled my hand away instinctively, and Megan's smile faded. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but behind that look, there was something predatory, something she was trying to hide. But now I could see clearly. "Why are you acting like this?" Her voice was calm, but there was a hidden tone of threat in her words. "It's me, I'm here." The forced smile returned to her face, stretching her lips uncomfortably. My mind was racing. I needed to get out of there, but how could I escape without drawing attention? How could I avoid letting it know that I knew? "Give me just a minute," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "I need to use the bathroom before we go." Megan hesitated, watching me for a second longer than usual, but finally nodded slightly. "Sure, I'll wait for you here." I entered the house, quickly moving away from her, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The voices and laughter of people around echoed in the distance, muffled by my chaotic thoughts. The bathroom was at the end of the hall. I locked the door behind me as soon as I entered, trying to control my breathing. I leaned on the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, and beads of sweat ran down my forehead. I needed to think. Something about that thing was imitating Megan, but how? And most importantly, where was the real Megan? My phone vibrated again in my pocket. I pulled it out with trembling hands, and when I looked at the screen, my stomach turned. Another message from Megan. "Where are you? I'm outside waiting for you." My blood ran cold. She was still out there, waiting, while that thing was on the porch watching me. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps began to echo down the hallway outside. Slowly, they were getting closer and closer. I knew I couldn't stay there for long. I unlocked the bathroom door as carefully as possible, praying it wouldn't make a sound. As soon as the footsteps faded, I opened the door and slipped down the hallway. Outside, I saw a figure standing exactly where Megan should have been. She was standing there, facing the car. She wasn't moving, as if she were waiting. Fear consumed me completely. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't confront that thing. I ran as fast as I could to the car, trying to be quick enough not to catch its attention. My heart was pounding like a drum as I opened the door and started the engine, without looking back. As soon as I put the car in motion, I heard a sound coming from the porch. A sharp scream, followed by the sound of something running toward me. I pressed the accelerator. As I sped away, I looked in the rearview mirror. There, standing in the middle of the road, was Megan, or whatever it was, watching me with eyes that now I knew never belonged to a human. Second story. My brother never came back. Growing up, my brother, Jake, and I were inseparable. Every weekend, without fail, we'd throw our rifles in the truck, pack a cooler with sandwiches and soda, and head into the forest just past the reservation. It was our sacred time, away from the noise, away from people. It's where we connected, not just as brothers, but as something deeper. Hunters. That weekend was no different. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the trees, casting long, eerie shadows over the campsite. We had already scouted a good spot to set up our tent, just before dusk settled in. The air was crisp with the early bite of fall, and the forest seemed quieter than usual. Too quiet now that I think about it. As we sat around the fire, roasting the last of the hot dogs and telling stupid stories, we heard it. Someone called my name. Not just any voice, my voice. It came from deep within the woods, carried on the wind like an echo of something lost. I turned to Jake, expecting him to laugh, maybe make some joke, but he looked just as confused as I was. "You heard that?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. "Yeah." His brows furrowed, glancing toward the dark tree line. "Maybe it's just someone playing around. Who'd be out here this late?" I asked, trying to brush it off, but the unease had already settled in my bones. This wasn't a place you messed around after dark. The locals had stories. Tales of things in the woods, voices that weren't real, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Jake shook his head, poking at the fire. Probably some idiot from town, trying to mess with us. The night grew colder, and the fire's warmth wasn't enough to shake the feeling that we were being watched. We tried to ignore it, laughing off our discomfort, but then the voice called again. This time it was louder, closer, called Jake's name, but Jake was sitting right next to me. "Jake, you?" I stopped mid-sentence when I saw the look on his face. He wasn't laughing anymore. His eyes darted around the camp, scanning the darkness as if searching for something he didn't want to find. "Cut it out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whoever's out there, this isn't funny." No reply, just the crackling of the fire and the heavy, silent weight of the forest around us. Hours passed in tense silence, both of us pretending to sleep in our tent, but neither of us really closing our eyes. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. I turned over to wake Jake, ready to pack up and get out of there. But when I looked at his sleeping bag, it was empty. "Jake," I called, expecting him to be gathering firewood or off by the river, but there was no response. The campsite was eerily still, the ashes of the fire long gone cold. My chest tightened, panic rising in the back of my throat as I yelled his name again. "Jake!" No answer. That's when I heard it. His voice, faint, distant, calling me from deep within the woods. "Tom!" The voice echoed, bouncing off the trees, fading into the distance. I grabbed my rifle, heart pounding, and ran in the direction of the sound, pushing through the thick underbrush. But no matter how far I went, how loudly I shouted, the voice stayed just beyond my reach. I spent the entire day searching, circling back to camp in the hopes that he'd return. But he never did. That night, as I sat by the dying fire, staring into the endless darkness of the forest, the voice came again. "Tom, I'm here." But I knew, deep down in the pit of my gut, that the voice wasn't really my brother's. Something was wrong, and whatever had taken him wasn't going to bring him back the same. The days after Jake disappeared were a blur of exhaustion and frustration. I barely ate, barely slept. All I could think about was finding him. I reported him missing, of course, but the sheriff's search turned up nothing. They combed the woods for days, helicopters and all, but not a single trace of him. Not even a footprint. Maybe he just left, one of the deputies had said, as if my brother would just walk out of my life without a word. I wanted to punch him, but I knew they weren't going to find Jake. Not if they were searching for a regular missing person. What took Jake wasn't normal. I knew that now. The voice kept haunting me. Every night, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, it would start. Faint at first, like a breeze moving through the trees, but then louder, clearer. Always calling my name. Always sounding exactly like Jake. "Tom, come find me." I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, hands gripping the sheets until my knuckles turned white, trying to drown out the sound. But it was no use. My brother was out there, or at least something that sounded like him, and every time I heard it, I felt it calling me deeper into the woods, further away from home. Then, one night, a week after he disappeared, Jake came back. I had just stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, the voice growing louder than it had ever been before. Seemed closer, almost inside my head. The night was still, No wind, no movement, just the oppressive weight of silence. That's when I saw him standing at the edge of the tree line. "Jake," I whispered, disbelief and hope twisting in my gut. He stepped forward, his figure illuminated by the dim porch light. It was Jake, or at least it looked like him. Same clothes, same shaggy brown hair, same tired look in his eyes. But something was wrong. I felt it before I could even see it. He was off. His eyes weren't quite right, unfocused, like they didn't belong in his skull. His movements were stiff, jerky, as if his limbs weren't used to being controlled. "Tom," he said, his voice raspy, like he'd been screaming for hours. I found my way back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to slam the door shut and never open it again. But this was my brother, Jake, my best friend, the guy who never let me down. And here he was, standing in front of me, looking like he'd been to hell and back. I thought you were dead," I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest. "Where have you been?" His lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Lost," he said, his voice low, like he was trying to keep a secret. "But I'm back now. I'm here." I hesitated, glancing at the rifle in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting just beyond the tree line, hidden in the shadows. But Jake was here. I couldn't leave him out there. I lowered the rifle, stepping aside. "Come inside." He moved past me, his body brushing against mine as he stepped over the threshold. I shivered, a cold chill running down my spine, even though the night air was warm. He walked slowly, deliberately, like he was trying to remember how to move in his own skin. We sat in silence for a while. Jake stared into space, his eyes glassy, like he wasn't really there. I asked him what had happened, where he'd gone, why he hadn't come back sooner, but he didn't answer. He just kept repeating the same words. "I'm back. I'm here." That night I barely slept. I could hear him moving around the house, his footsteps slow and uneven. Sometimes, I would hear him muttering to himself, speaking in a low, hushed tone that I couldn't quite make out. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't long before I woke up to the sound of my own name. "Tom." It wasn't a shout or a whisper. It was just there, like it was coming from inside my head. I jolted upright, heart pounding, and saw Jake standing in the doorway of my room, his face pale and his eyes wide. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice monotone, almost robotic. "It's too loud." I swallowed, the unease clawing at my chest. "What's too loud, Jake?" "The voices," he replied, tilting his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "They won't stop." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Voices? What voices?" Jake stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked away without another word. The silence that followed was suffocating. The next morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at me when I walked in, but it wasn't like before. There was something different about the way he looked at me now, like he was seeing me for the first time or maybe for the last. "Tom," he said, his voice low and hollow. "I think something followed me back." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. His lips twitched into that same unsettling smile as before. "It's still out there. It's waiting." Jake's words echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. Still out there. It's waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond our sight, watching, waiting for the right moment. Jake wasn't himself. Whatever came back from the woods wasn't him. At least not entirely. The next few days were worse. Jake barely spoke, and when he did, his words were cryptic, nonsensical. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring at me with those strange, empty eyes, like he was studying me, trying to figure out who or what I was. Every night, I'd hear him muttering to himself, pacing back and forth, sometimes stopping to stand at the window, gazing out at the forest. I tried to convince myself that it was just trauma, that whatever had happened out there had messed with his mind. But deep down, I knew better. The Jake I knew was gone. Or maybe he was never really gone, because he never came back. Then it happened. One night, as I lay in bed, drifting between sleep and waking, I heard it again. The voice. But this time, it wasn't calling from the woods. It was inside the house. Tom! I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice wasn't Jake's, it was mine. My own voice, coming from somewhere in the darkness of the house. I grabbed the rifle from beside the bed, my hands shaking, and crept toward the hallway. My footsteps were slow, deliberate, as I strained to hear where the voice was coming from. Tom! It called again, this time closer. Too close. I stepped into the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. The house was pitch black, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon outside. My fingers tightened around the rifle as I moved toward the living room, the voice growing louder, more insistent. And then I saw him. Jake was standing in the middle of the room, his back to me, his head tilted to one side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. His body was unnaturally still, almost rigid, like a statue frozen in place. Jake? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. What's going on? He didn't respond, didn't even turn around. Instead, he lifted his hand slowly, pointing toward the window that faced the woods. They're calling me, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I followed his gaze to the window. Outside, beyond the treeline, shadows moved in the darkness. Not animals, not the wind, but figures, humanoid shapes, just out of sight, shifting between the trees. Who's calling you? I asked, my throat dry. Jake turned to me slowly, and when he did, I saw the full extent of the change. His eyes. They weren't Jake's eyes anymore. They were hollow, empty, like two black pits that seemed to swallow the light. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his smile, that terrible, twisted smile that never reached his eyes. Them, he whispered. The ones who took me. I took a step back, the rifle shaking in my hands. What do you mean? What are you talking about? He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver through my entire body. They wanted you, Tom, but I brought them me instead. My stomach dropped. What are you saying? Jake's smile widened, his face stretching in an unnatural way. They didn't want me. They wanted you, but I made a deal. To let me go, to let me come back. I could barely breathe. My chest tightened, the air feeling too thick to draw in. Jake, what did you do? They needed something to return with me, he continued, his voice a low hiss. A piece of them to make the exchange. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying, but nothing made sense. I stumbled backward, bumping into the kitchen table, my pulse roaring in my ears. You're not making sense, Jake. What the hell are you talking about? They're here, he said, his voice eerily calm. And now, they want to finish what they started. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, slowly at first, and then all at once, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. The wind howled through the house, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into complete darkness. Tom, the voice called again, but this time it wasn't just mine. It was Jake's, and it came from the woods. The real Jake. My heart stopped. The figure standing in front of me, this thing that looked like Jake, wasn't my brother. The real Jake was still out there, trapped, calling to me from wherever they had taken him. In the darkness, the shadowy figures from the woods stepped into the house, their outlines just barely visible in the faint moonlight. Their eyes glowed, bright and unnatural, fixed on me. My grip on the rifle tightened, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. I wasn't dealing with something human. They're here to take you, the thing that looked like Jake said, stepping closer. But don't worry, brother. I'll keep you company. It lunged at me, its mouth stretching wide into an unnatural, gaping grin. I raised the rifle, but before I could fire, everything went black. The last thing I heard was my own voice. No, Jake's voice, whispering in the darkness. Come with us. And then, there was nothing. Third story. The thing on the road. I never liked driving at night. There's something unsettling about those endless roads that cut through the dark countryside, especially when you're alone. No lights, no civilization. Just you, your car, and the long, black strip of asphalt stretching forever into the horizon. But that night, I had no choice. It was late, and I had just left my friend's cabin after a weekend away. The good kind of weekend, filled with laughs, drinks, and stupid stories around a bonfire. But as I drove home, a creeping unease began to settle in. Maybe it was the isolation of the road, the way the world outside my car was pitch black, broken only by the dim headlights illuminating a few feet ahead. Or maybe it was the silence, too heavy, too thick. I was deep into that silence when I saw something. At first, it was just a shadow on the side of the road, barely noticeable, like a dark lump against the even darker surroundings. Roadkill, I thought. It wasn't uncommon on these back roads, but as I got closer, something felt off. The shape wasn't quite right. I slowed down, squinting into the night, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was a deer, maybe a dog. It was too big to be a raccoon or some other small animal. Whatever it was definitely dead, or so I thought. Just as I was about to pass it, the thing moved. Not a small twitch, but a slow, deliberate movement, like it was struggling to get up. Instinctively, I pressed on the brake, my car coming to a crawl as I stared at it, heart racing. It wasn't a deer. It looked like a dog, some sort of stray, but larger. Its fur was matted, and its body twisted in ways that didn't make sense, like it had been hit by something and its bones had healed wrong. But the worst part was its eyes. As I pulled up closer, I saw them, too bright, too aware. Those eyes weren't animal eyes. They were human. I froze, hands gripping the wheel tightly as the creature slowly lifted its head and turned towards me. And then it smiled. A smile on a dog's face, if you could even call it a dog. It was grotesque, impossible, and yet there it was, grinning at me. I thought I must have been hallucinating, that my mind was playing tricks on me from exhaustion. But then it whispered my name. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car screeching forward as I left that thing behind, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see it again. When I got home, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something outside, a scratching sound, faint but unmistakable. It was right outside my window, like claws against wood. I didn't move. I didn't dare check. But in the darkness, I could feel it. Whatever I'd seen on that road hadn't stayed behind. It had followed me, and it was waiting. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. It had to be. Sleep deprivation, combined with the creepy isolation of the road, had twisted my mind. There was no other explanation for what I saw. No logical explanation for why an animal would whisper my name or why it had those eyes. I buried the memory as best as I could, chalking it up to exhaustion, and tried to move on. But something had changed. That scratching sound, it wasn't my imagination. When I got out of bed, I noticed faint marks on the window frame, like claws had dragged against the wood. My stomach twisted in knots. Maybe it had been a raccoon or some other animal. But the placement of the scratches, right outside my bedroom window, was too deliberate, too unsettling. I wanted to believe it was something mundane, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking behind me, but there was never anything there. When I'd walk past a window at night, I'd feel a presence, as if eyes were boring into me from the darkness outside. I tried ignoring it, but it was always there. The subtle paranoia, the sense that something was lurking just out of sight. It wasn't until the following Friday that things took a darker turn. I had almost convinced myself that the whole encounter was just a freak incident, a moment of misperception. But as the sun went down that night, I felt the familiar unease creeping in. I distracted myself with TV, trying not to think about the road, the creature, or the way it had whispered my name. I had almost managed to push the memory to the back of my mind when the sound started again. The scratching. It was soft at first, barely audible over the noise of the television. I muted the show, sitting perfectly still as I strained to hear. Scritch, scratch. It was coming from the same window, the one outside my bedroom. My heart began to race as I stood up, adrenaline already coursing through my veins. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, and crept toward the window. I didn't know what I was expecting to see, but I had to check. I couldn't keep living in fear. As I approached the window, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and my hand shook as I reached for the curtain. In one swift motion, I pulled it back and shined the flashlight outside. Nothing, just the empty yard. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, their shadows casting long, eerie shapes across the ground. My body relaxed slightly. I was being paranoid again. But just as I turned to walk away, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep and rumbling, coming from right below the window. My heart stopped. Slowly, I turned the flashlight back, aiming it downward toward the base of the house. And that's when I saw it. The thing from the road was crouched just beneath the window, its twisted, matted body illuminated by the harsh beam of light. But this time it was worse. Its limbs were unnaturally long, bent at grotesque angles, and its face, that smile, was wider now, stretching impossibly across its snout, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. And those eyes, still human, still staring directly into mine, locked onto me with an intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. It didn't move at first. It just stared at me, that horrible smile never faltering. Then, slowly, it began to rise, standing on two legs like a person, though its body was still shaped like a dog. Tilted its head, like it was studying me, waiting. And then, in that same low whisper I'd heard on the road, it said my name again. Mark! I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight as I fell onto the floor. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. My mind was racing, my body trembling uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. My mind kept replaying that image of the creature, its eyes, its smile, the way it had spoken to me like it knew me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every creak and groan of the house making me jump. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here anymore. Whatever that thing was, it was coming for me, and I had no idea what it wanted. The following day, I packed what I could and left my house. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I needed to get away, far away. I call it a vacation, but in reality I was running. Running from something I didn't understand, from something that shouldn't exist. I told myself that once I got some distance, the terror would fade. Maybe I'd even laugh about it one day, tell myself it had all been some kind of bizarre, twisted nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. That thing wasn't done with me. I drove for hours, barely paying attention to where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, keep putting miles between me and whatever had crawled out of the darkness that night. Eventually, I found myself at a motel on the outskirts of some small town I'd never heard of. It was run down, the kind of place that people stopped at only when they had nowhere else to go. But it would have to do. I checked in, tossing my bags onto the bed and collapsing onto the mattress. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but even as my body screamed for rest, my mind wouldn't let go. I kept replaying that moment over and over, the way the thing had stood, its grotesque body moving like it wasn't bound by the same rules of nature. And those eyes, those damn eyes. As the sun began to set, my anxiety only grew. I turned on the TV, trying to drown out the silence, but it was no use. Every creak, every gust of wind outside felt like a warning. I was convinced that thing would find me no matter how far I ran. That night, I fell into a restless sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but at some point, I woke to the sound of scratching. Again, my heart sank. It was here. The scratching was louder this time, more frantic, like it was trying to get in. It wasn't coming from the window like before. It was at the door. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears as the scratching turned into a low, rhythmic thumping, like something was pushing against the door. Thud, thud, thud. I sat up in bed, my eyes locked on the door, terrified of what I would see if it opened. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. All I could do was listen as the sound continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was on the other side was toying with me, enjoying my fear. Then it spoke again, in that same raspy, almost human voice. "Mark, come out." I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body tense. It was my name, but it sounded wrong, twisted, like it had practiced saying it but couldn't quite get it right. The door rattled on its hinges, and I knew I couldn't stay in the room any longer. Grabbing my keys and my phone, I bolted out the back window, crashing into the night. I ran to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The motel parking lot was empty, the highway beyond it a dark and endless ribbon of asphalt. I couldn't stop shaking as I finally got the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut. I hit the gas, speeding away as fast as the car would go. But as I pulled onto the highway, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. The thing was standing in the parking lot, watching me leave, its glowing eyes following my every move. It didn't chase me, didn't even try to stop me. It just stood there, smiling, like it knew something I didn't. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going, but just needing to escape. The highway stretched out in front of me, empty and silent. But as I drove, something strange happened. The road began to look familiar. Too familiar. It was the same road, the one from that night. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape it. The road stretched endlessly, looping back on itself, leading me right back to where it all began. The dark, empty road, the place where I'd first seen it. And then, in the distance, I saw something, a figure, standing by the side of the road. My headlights illuminated its twisted form as I approached, and my blood ran cold. It was the creature. It smiled at me as I slowed the car, its eyes locking onto mine, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I didn't want to stop, didn't want to get closer, but it was like something was pulling me in, forcing me to face it. I braked to a stop just a few feet away, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension thick in the air. Then, slowly, it started to move toward the car, its long limbs bending unnaturally as it walked. I wanted to drive away, but I couldn't move. My hands were frozen on the wheel. It stopped beside the car, placing one clawed hand on the hood, leaning in close. Its face was inches from mine now, and I could see every sickening detail, the matted fur, the twisted bones, the two human eyes. It opened its mouth, revealing those yellowed, jagged teeth, and then it whispered, "You can't leave." The last thing I remember is the creature's smile, wide and grotesque, before everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my bed, at home. The scratches on my window were gone. The road, the motel, it was as if none of it had ever happened. But I know the truth. I haven't seen it since that night, but I can feel it, watching, waiting, and I know that one day it will come for me again, because you can't run from the thing in the road. It always finds you in the end.